On this episode, we get our heads shrunk by who? Welcome to Save Every Universe. My name is Alec Garcia. I am an engineer employed by the Wayland-Yutani Corporation looking for my mother and hiding from a violent extraterrestrial.
And I am Robbie. I'm an Italian doctor who takes on waves of viruses with my array of colorful pills.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Who were you last week?
Last week, I was Hawk from Dragon Age 2.
And I was Booker DeWitt from Bioshock Infinite. We talked about...
Booker DeWitt.
Booker DeWitt. If you missed it, last week we talked about the best video game openings just to kick the new year off, and Bioshock was among some of the best video game openings of all time. Today we're talking about, you may have heard, if you are into gaming news, that WHO, the World Health Organization, they put out like a draft of the new disorders and how they're going to update their listing of disorders. And among them was something called gaming disorder, which is basically video game addiction. And we've actually talked about this a little bit. We talked about like the most addictive games we've ever played in the early podcast.
Yeah, at the beginning of the year.
It was a little more cheeky. It was like, what are those games that really grab you and pull you in and that kind of thing. It was a little not talking about a mental disorder necessarily. And then we talked about it again with life-saving power of video games, sort of talking about the positive side of it, that there is research showing that playing video games has positive aspects to it that can help with depression, problem solving, boosting self-esteem. But this gaming disorder classification that WHO is wanting to put out is very much like it is addictive, like gambling or like drugs or like alcohol kind of thing.
So what this is there's a draft. It's a beta draft of the International Classification of Diseases.
Right.
It's supposed to come out sometime in 2018, and it hasn't been updated since 1990. So this is a pretty big deal. This is what the international medical community uses as kind of a launching off point for research, a place for collaboration. So it's something they all try and agree on, and so they can kind of go forward with it. There's been other proposals.
Like the DSM, I forget what it stands for, but it's a big book of disorders and the conditions and those kinds of things. And online gaming addiction has been in there for a while, for a couple of years at least.
I think it was actually rejected in 2013. It's in there as just we need more data.
Oh, for further study. That's right.
Yeah, so there wasn't anything conclusive.
Right.
So if you're seeing headlines about this, just know this is a beta draft. And so there's backlash, there's a lot of controversy over this. It may not end up in the final cut. But just so you know where we're coming from. So in the International Classification of Diseases, the ICD, I think is what you'll see it abbreviated as. It's under behavioral disorders, and it's right next to gambling addiction.
Yeah.
And it falls under the parent of mental disorder and then substance abuse or addictive behaviors. I mean, that's pretty serious. The substance abuse is what you'd expect. It's alcohol, drug abuse, those kinds of things.
Right.
And then gambling, and then gaming disorder.
Right.
So it's put in a pretty heavyweight category.
Yes, definitely.
You'll see a lot of news articles. Kotaku's put stuff out, BBC, CNN. There's been a lot of traction on this.
Yeah, and some of the articles I was reading, there was a Polygon and Kotaku. They interviewed, I think Kotaku was the actual direct source with this guy, Dr. Chris Ferguson, and he was talking about how it gets compared to like cocaine or drugs or alcohol, and it doesn't actually, it's very misleading to associate the two that way because it doesn't actually act in the brain the same way. It is closer to gambling than it probably is to an actual substance that you ingest. But he also makes the point too that like such a small minority of people are actually gaming addicts that it's pretty misleading that anyone who is a hobbyist. So I guess let's start there. What, like in your mind after reading all this stuff, like where, if this becomes a thing that it gets classified as a disorder, where is the line between somebody who's an enthusiast and a hobbyist and somebody who actually has a real problem? Because Vice put out a great article of people who really have serious issues with it that like don't leave and they're playing 60 hours a week and they don't do anything else, and it really is destructive to their life, health issues and all kinds of other things.
Right. And other doctors are citing examples like people who treat children who, I read a case where there was a guy who, he said his patient tried to kill themselves after the parents took away the router.
Yeah, right.
He was like a 16-year-old kid.
Yeah, and then there was, I didn't realize this story happened in New Mexico. We're in New Mexico if you're a first-time listener, but in Las Cruces, the woman who her child starved in her home because she was playing WoW so much, she just didn't feed her kid and her kid starved to death. That happened here in New Mexico. So, there are some really serious things that happen. Where is that line? Because what if somebody's a movie buff, right? If they watch a ton of movies, right? Like I knew a guy who, when Netflix was in its early days and it was pre-streaming, it's like they had to send the discs and stuff like that. I think this guy got close to watching almost every single movie that they had in their catalog in the early days of it. It was just crazy. He watched like dozens of movies every single week. And I remember being around him a couple of times and people just, their reaction to it was like, oh, you're a movie buff. Like that was their reaction. If anyone put that amount of time into playing video games, it would be like, gosh, you have a problem. And when are you going to, do something different with your time or something like that? Like, so where's the line between being like a movie buff, being a video game buff and enthusiast and it being like a destructive sort of thing? And I think that's where they're trying and this is a beta draft. I think that's where they're trying to go in this direction is just defining where that line is. But it doesn't, based on the definition that they're putting forward, it doesn't really seem like any of that is present to really give a clear direction to that.
Yeah. Well, okay. So why don't I read some of the actual definitions? So this is actually from the ICD, their beta classification. This is straight from their manual. And we'll just go through this really quick. So in order for a disorder generally to be considered a disorder, it has to meet all of these things. Now, the articles I've been reading haven't really emphasized that. They're like, oh, a few of these things, whatever. But from what I understand, and I've talked to some students and other people who've studied this kind of thing, they say that in order for like it to be a real disorder, you've got to hit all of them. So just before I even go into this, that's one of my biggest concerns with this is that the enthusiast gets pinged because he matches one of these or two of these. And this has 3 and a bunch of subcategories. But basically it's impaired control over gaming. So if you are unable to stop playing, you're playing for just
doing it really a lot compulsively.
Yeah, and you can't like walk away from it. I have increasing priority given to gaming to the extent that gaming takes precedence over other life interests and daily activities. And I know at my low points, I've been there. But I was also unhealthy. And I would have admitted it at that time. And then 3, continuation of escalation of gaming despite the occurrence of negative consequences. That one was a little tough for me. Like, I don't know if it means negative consequences in real life, like you see your life going down the crapper and you're doing it anyway. That's what I assume.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the Vice article, they had a couple good quotes. There was a guy named Brett who just played Counter-Strike really like obsessively, and he said, I decided that he played Counter-Strike and then he flipped over to WoW. So this is when he was playing WoW. I decided that the progression of my WoW character was more meaningful than the progression of myself in real life. It's much more quantifiable. It's so visible. It's more entertaining than real life. It's easier than real life. This guy was very aware that he was shutting out the real world and that he just didn't want anything to do with it anymore. And he was going, I mean, I think you probably could draw, even though it doesn't function the same way in the brain, you could draw a little bit of a comparison there to something like drugs or alcohol, where the person realizes they're going down the hole and they choose it. They would rather be drunk or they would rather be high than deal with their life.
Right. But this is also where some psychologists like criticize these types of classifications, because a lot of psychologists would argue that it doesn't matter what the thing that you're doing is. The problem is, why do you hate your life? Why are you running from it? Or why are you so unhappy? And they're gonna, if you're in that part, if it's depression that needs to be treated or bipolar or something, if you're having deeper issues, you're kind of treating the symptom and not the problem. And that would be an argument.
And that was my biggest takeaway from reading a bunch of these articles, was that it seems to be a lot of the fear from the people who are, clinical professionals who are criticizing this. They say that the danger is that these kids or adults or whoever they are, some of these people are 30. There was a lady in here in the Vice article, I think, that was 69-year-old recovering addict or whatever, is that they will get diagnosed with gaming disorder, and that they'll get treated for, here's how you don't play games anymore. But the real issue underneath is depression or anxiety or ADD or whatever the issue is. And that more time and more money doesn't go to treating the real issue. It goes to trying to get them to not play video games or whatever.
Right. And that is one of the criticisms of classifying this as a gaming disorder, is now the funding and attention that could be diverted to treating depression or recognizing that through technology or something.
Actually dealing with the real issue.
Now, I don't know. This is tough because it seems to me, especially since I'm not a doctor, but it seems like when you have a disorder that's based on like exercise, like a body image disorder or something like that, even though those things are disorders, it does tend to touch on a fundamental something else. You're not satisfied with your body image or something like that. And it seems like when you're getting into things like drugs and alcohol, it's like actually altering the state of your brain. There's actually like chemicals, and it's changing the way your brain functions. And I didn't read anything that says that about gaming. I mean, I read that there's severe consequences, but nothing in the stuff I went through, at least in, from the couple days that we were doing research on this, talked about how it's actually changing the chemistry of your brain. You know?
Well, I did see one quote from Chris Ferguson with the Kotaku thing where he said, I'll just read this quote. Dr. Chris Ferguson told Kotaku that while myths about the similarities of gaming and substance abuse persist, they are true only insofar as any pleasurable activities activates that region of the brain. How gaming involves them is more similar to fun activities like eating chocolate, having sex, or getting a good grade, etc., not similar to heroin or cocaine. So I think there is that release of pleasure or whatever, and there probably is like a little bit of that like rewiring sort of thing, but it's more of like the rush of like, or like the satisfaction of getting a good grade or getting that achievement or getting a good score in PvP.
Right.
I think that's more where that pleasure thing comes from, or getting a good loot drop. And I think the loot drops and the loot boxes and all that stuff, I think there's a more interesting conversation there about it being similar to gambling. And all through 2017, that's been the discussion of should loot boxes and pay to win and all that stuff, like, should that be regulated like gambling? You're paying real money to get random stuff.
Yeah. But to me, that's fundamentally different than just playing video games a lot.
Yeah, if you're playing just a basic offline game where you're not spending money or whatever, I would agree. I think I agree with this statement. It is closer to getting a good grade than it is to
like a substance abuse.
Yeah, drinking alcohol or something like that.
I am curious where this is going to go going forward. I think it's the Electronic Software Association. They came out with a statement kind of asking the WHO to reconsider.
Right.
And they think this actually like detracts from other diseases, that this will like draw away from it. I'm personally a little concerned you'd see like a lot of knee-jerk reactions, parents being like,
I read
this article that said, and you know, and that's always kind of a fear, especially when you see something that's this mainstream.
Right.
And a lot of the articles, some of them I read
getting
were
a lot of
written.
news press and a lot of news time and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, but some of them are crap.
Yeah.
Like some of those articles are written like, well, we always called it and there's good reason and there you go. Like there was no backing it up. And then there was some articles that were kind of misleading, like this was something to do with children.
Right.
Like this was to protect the children.
Yeah, and we had an episode about like who gamers really are, and there's more women over 30 who game than there are boys under 18.
Right.
Which is just such a mind-blowing statistic. So you're right, yeah, and a lot of these articles talk like kids are getting addicted to games, but they're not the majority of who's playing.
Right. And based on like the actual, like from the handbook and the stuff I was reading, it had nothing to do with age.
Right.
The articles that you may find about this are a little misleading because it's going to tell you about like 16-year-olds, young teenagers, and a lot of the doctors that are talking about these real issues. I mean, there are like the 60-year-old gaming addict, but a lot of these people who are having these issues are young teenagers. And again, I wouldn't be surprised if there's more there digging. Like, why
some of the articles I found too, like the Vice article, for example, when you look at that guy, the Brett guy, his trajectory, it was in his early 20s, and a lot of the stories that I've read seem to be more people trying to transition out of teen to like adulthood and don't do it very well, and then they start to get depressed.
There's like a failure to launch.
Exactly, and just start playing video games. But the issue isn't that they're playing video games. The issue is that they don't know what to do and they're depressed and they're anxious or whatever. There's probably 1,000 other things that you should talk about before you pick out gaming there.
And that's probably not a new issue.
Yeah.
I'm sure back in the whenevers, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, this was always an issue. And it was depressing, and it is
in the 90s, they talked about like just sitting on your butt. Like even if it wasn't video games, it's like sitting on your butt watching TV. And it was like, okay, like the TV's rotting your brain and all, like all that, whatever the technology is. But
it really comes down to a little bit, on those cases at least, that seems like it's that failure to launch. They're lost, they're depressed, and so the technology or the alcohol or whatever it is what's getting blamed.
And one of the things that I did see that I thought was just a really good way to summarize all that is that people who are more prone to really highly indulging escapism are also people who are really highly prone to things like depression and anxiety. So it's not that the video games is causing it. It's more that that personality type is just drawn to escapism in some form or another.
Right. Yeah. And video games are a convenient escapism.
Yeah.
I think we should, though, I think we've mostly favored like against it, but there are some good arguments for it. There are some pros.
Yeah.
Just if this was legitimized, there is more research that will be done on it, and that's always a positive thing.
Right.
There'll be more funds available. There'll be more. More if doctors are looking for this clinically, they can compare notes. The international community could look at this.
Yeah.
We could see how it's different in different parts of the world, how if it's a localized thing, if it's a phenomenon that's happening everywhere,
right.
Is it a first world problem? Like those kinds of things are important. And
I think there does need to be more study of it. I mean, like even they've done studies too about like the impact of social media and constant presence of cell phones on teenagers, and that social media and constant comparison to like outside images does lead to depression and anxiety and these other things. So we talked before about like how video games can aid in the recovery from depression.
Yeah.
So you get these really conflicting messages. So I totally agree. There has to be more research into how there's so much more media in our faces all the time than ever before. Like somebody has to be studying this shit and figuring out what it's doing to us and what it's doing to kids and what it's doing to young adults and what it's there has to be more research. I do agree with that.
And we've said kind of this general idea before, but video games aren't just video games. So to blanket state something like this, like gaming disorder, it causes, I think it's a misnomer.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like if with more research available and more resources geared towards it, we could see how these types of video games affect this. Shooting games encourage hand-eye coordination or whatever. You know, we would have the resources to specialize and maybe go further down.
And I think there's a huge, like you said earlier, like not all games are created equally, but we were talking about it earlier that like the random drops and stuff like that are a little bit closer to gambling. And I think it seems like games like WoW, games like Destiny, games like that have the random chance of getting a new piece of gear and that kind of, they incentivize you to grind. And Destiny, Bungie's come right out and said that they want this to be your hobby.
Yeah.
So if you were to phrase that a little bit differently, they're engineering their game to be at least on some level addictive.
Right.
So I think certain types of games are evolving they are trying to make their games more and more addictive. So I think, but that's not the same thing as playing, I don't know, getting the Final Fantasy VI port on your iPhone. Like those aren't going to be the same experience.
Yeah, so I think the more research towards that, and if we start saying, hey, this is a bad thing, this is causing developmental problems, that'll put developers in like, we shouldn't do this or whatever. Yeah. We need to retool our game to be a little bit differently.
I think they're going to get regulated from outside before they...
Probably, but that'll be that'll be easier to legislate if that's what needs to be done.
Right.
If there's research and data to back it up. It's been interesting in some of these other countries. One of the articles talked about how Korea has like a curfew for adolescent players.
Yeah.
Like children aren't supposed to be online playing games between like midnight and 6 a.m.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Japan has like alerts that'll come on. If you've been gaming, you've put in too many hours, it starts like telling you to knock that shit off or tone it down. China has regulatory laws on a lot of the more popular games on kids and how many hours they're allowed to like encourage kids to play.
Right.
Or they'll start like fining one of the bigger companies and stuff. So I think you're right. That's clearly external regulation, but that may be what it comes to here. None of that really bothered me too much. I was just like, I don't know why kids should be playing 12 to 6.
Yeah.
I did it. I guess we did a little bit in our teenage years, but we shouldn't have. We should have been in bed.
But it was much more of a social thing. It was always like groups hanging out playing games
like several
way too
of us
late.
doing
And it was much more of a social thing, and it seems like the stories where it's like this is how this addiction spiraled. It's long periods of isolation.
Right.
And it was always a social thing.
You know what we didn't even mention was one of the aspects of the ICD, this new classification, is that it's been going on, all these severe whatever symptoms for over a year, generally.
Yeah.
It's not just like, you did this for a month, or it was one game that you got
anyone who's an enthusiast hobbyist gamer has like gone down the rabbit hole with a game and for like a one of the articles I was reading was like Breath of the Wild or something. I was like,
to shower.
I forgot. Yeah, that's right. It's like I took that thing to the bathroom. I was playing that game nonstop on the Switch.
Yeah, but this is more than just like you got that one good game for a month and then you realized, I let some shit fall off the table.
It's a habitual. And I think the isolation really is one of like those deciding factors. But one more thing I do want to say is just sort of in favor of it is that a lot of these articles were sort of written from the perspective of like, oh, poor gamers, what if they get stigmatized? Yeah. Gamers have like always been stigmatized. I don't think the gamers that have a little bit, they're enthusiasts, they're hobbyists, they play a lot, but their life's not all out of balance and that kind of thing. They're not going to be the ones that are affected at all.
That's probably true.
Being a gamer still isn't cool anyway. So what the hell does it matter?
Well, it's cooler than it used to be.
It's true.
I mean, I think it's easy for us to say that because when we were playing games in high school, it was not cool.
Right.
You couldn't go down to Hot Topic and buy it like a game. I'm wearing like my McCree shirt. You couldn't buy a video game shirt this easily,
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of reasons.
That's
it's a
true.
lot cooler.
But it's still not, I mean, not mainstream cool. I mean, like, I think most parents still have the image that it's like little kids that do it and it's dangerous and they shouldn't get too much screen time and stuff like that.
Maybe. Yeah. I think there is a lot of that. I do think it's a lot more aware. And even some of the stuff we talked about, like who is the common gamer and stuff, it is a lot more common.
Yeah.
Like I was wearing a jacket with Overwatch on it and
Yeah.
I've like got stopped.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, this is crazy.
I've gotten that with the Resident Evil shirt too.
Yeah.
That shirt, man.
Whereas that would have never, I don't even think that would ever happen to me like 15.
So let me say this though, people don't play games to be cool for the most part.
That's fair.
Okay.
Yeah, I would definitely
and so
say that.
like for somebody to say like, oh, that's bad for you, like gamers didn't set out to like do it because we do it because we like it, but it's not like I'm making a health choice and I'm gonna get it. Like
yeah, that's
or
true.
so, you know what I mean? It's not like a mainstream trendy thing in the way that some other things are. You don't do it to be cool, you do it because you like it.
That's a fair
for
point.
the most part.
And there was some backlash in the 90s, right? Where it was like the same kind of thing. Where it was like gaming's the devil, it's going to ruin everything, and didn't really slow us down much, I don't think.
And for those people that like just like to play games, it ends up just sort of, I don't want to paint the gamer as like a rebel or a bad boy or anything, because like that's really stupid, but kind of, it's just sort of,
It's a counterculture. It's a little bit of a subculture. I don't really give a shit what you think.
That's a good
I'm
way
gonna
to
do
say it.
this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
we're not starting a revolution or anything.
So I will say that like to that point, like it's the whole conversation's sort of irrelevant. Who cares what passes about or what they classify as this or that, right? But in a positive, if this is what it takes for like for the minority to actually like get help.
Yeah.
Like, because maybe they go
Get
into
insurance
treatment
coverage
for quote gaming addiction and then their depression does get treated or something like that. So if it is a step toward people who need help getting help, I don't know. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for it to start, for there at least to be a step forward in like putting language around identifying those issues.
That's
in
fair.
a gaming context.
I mean, the best case scenario is that doctors would then be able to study this, research it, gather data, and realize, hey, this is a symptom of depression.
Yeah.
Or when you're seeing these types of signs.
Because even if it does, I mean, if it really is an isolation issue with a child, for example, or a teenager or something like that, and a parent says, hey, my kid's gaming too much, that's the problem, and it at least gets them to, I say something's not right here, we need help. And then then the kid or teenager or young adult gets treated for anxiety or depression. Like
or
that's a win,
whatever.
I think.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think I kind of think in the end it's a little bit irrelevant to the core majority player base that loves to play but isn't out of balance in their life with it, and it could be a good step for people who actually need help.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I still don't feel like super comfortable seeing it listed next to like
Gambling
heroin and all the other things when I was reading through, but
which is where a lot of the clinical professionals, that seems to be their beef with it more than anything. It's not that it shouldn't be classified, it's that they're classifying it wrong without fully understanding it. Yeah.
And I think in that regard, I still agree. I think maybe it's a little too soon to like slap it in the books and call it a disorder and put it up there next to gambling.
Yeah.
But the fact that it's even generating this much conversation is good.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool to be reading these articles by doctors and psychologists. And I'm like, I don't know
They're
if any of these
talking
guys
about gaming.
Yeah. I'm like, I don't even know they've ever played a game in their life, but they're talking about like something that's
one of them. Don't quote me on this, but I think the Chris Ferguson guy, it was either him or there was another guy, Dr. Gentile or something like that. But one of them he was a gamer, and he set out to like disprove like this can't possibly be a thing. And then he found out that in certain cases there actually are real issues.
Yeah. But I think ultimately, I don't say this often, but I do hope that science and progress helps on this one.
Yeah.
No matter how it ends up falling.
Right.
I hope that if it's denied, it just spurs them to do more and figure out where it should go or how we should like deal with these types of issues.
I mean, there are enough cases where you hear just really sad shit where like quote gaming destroys your life or whatever that we have to talk about it, like the gaming community and the medical community and all that. People have to talk about it. Those people need to get help.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for listening to Save Every Universe. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with a friend.
Also, if you have a question or an episode idea or want to reach out to us, especially on an episode like this, you can email us at saveeveryuniverse@gmail.com.